The first speaker tonight, we are really, really pleased to welcome Larry Elliott from The Guardian. And as I said to him, as a Mancunian, is almost the last reason I ever still buy The Guardian. So I'm pleased to see him. Okay, so Larry Elliott, please, would you like to step?
Well, thank you very much, Jackie, and it's really good to be here amongst a friendly audience. Makes a bit of a change, I have to say. In fact, I was at a Guardian event a few weeks ago. The Guardian now has a way of trying to raise money, which essentially is to sort of beg for money from its readers. You probably realise online, I have a little passive-aggressive begging letter. And there are people who pay a considerable amount of money to be Guardian patrons. So, they said, come along and speak to a Guardian event about Brexit. So, it's an audience of about 200 people, 199 Remainers, and me. And at one point, somebody rather incredulously said to me, so, why are you in favour of Brexit? As though it was, some sort of terrible disease, I'd call, And I said, well, really, there are 5 reasons. 5 reasons. One is I'm a Democrat. People voted for it. And, 17.4 million people, you ignore them at your peril. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is that Brexit was about class. There's a sort of feeling almost that, Brexit was just a sort of revolt of the English Shire counties and a bunch of UKIP voters. But actually, this was a vote of Britain's forgotten working class. Really, discontented about austerity, poverty pay, the way they'd been treated. And some on the Remainer side spent quite a lot of their lives saying, you must give a bigger voice to working people, you must hear working people, we must not ignore the poor. And as soon as you give the working people a chance to have their voice, you can't then say to them, what we don't like the answers you've given us in a referendum, go away and have another thing. So this was a referendum primarily, I thought, about class. And again, you ignore that vote at your peril. Third reason, throughout my long time at The Guardian, I've always been opposed to groupthink, and it seems to me that the current debate is in real danger of being dominated by groupthink, of the same sort of groupthink that said in 1990 that it was a great idea for Britain to join the ERM, and in the early 2000s said it would be a fantastic idea if Britain joined the single currency. And at the time, some of us on the left said that actually both the ERM and the single currency would create a reserve army of unemployment, that they were wrong-headed neoliberal policies that were anti-working class, and so it's been proved. Reason number 4, Europe isn't working. It might be working for some multinational companies, it might be working for German exporters, but it's not working for Europe and European people as a whole. It's not the cuddly, progressive institution that many on the Remain side of the argument seem to think. The 4 pillars, 4 freedoms, so-called, of free movement of capital, people, services and goods are essentially the 4 pillars of market fundamentalism, enshrined by the Lisbon Treaty into the European Constitution and reinforced by anti-worker decisions by the European Court of Justice. It's really, I find it kind of incredible that people on the left somehow see what's going on in Europe as a progressive movement when it's quite the contrary. It's a reactionary programme, and that's why large parts of the European working class have rebelled against it. 5th and final reason, Britain isn't working either. Fortunately, it's the one country in Western Europe that retains a real functioning working class party. It hasn't been eviscerated in the way that the French Socialist Party has, or the German SDP, SPD has been, by its support for the neoliberal policies enshrined in the European Union Constitution. It's still quite possible to conceive of a radical Labour government here dedicated to the sorts of policies that are needed to bring about a socialist transformation of Britain. And you know, in my analysis, the current state of Britain is that we have a gigantic hedge fund, which is the City of London, surrounded by vast parts of the country, which are essentially very much like a developing country and in need of the sort of policies that a developing country would be tempted to follow. Infant industry support, procurement policies that regenerate manufacturing, state aid policies, policies to do with ownership of the means of production and the commanding heights of the economy. All those policies would be available to a Labour government after Brexit, but only after a Brexit that is a really meaningful Brexit, not a halfway house like the so-called Norway option or customs common market too. Now, you know, ideally, we would have a Europe-wide movement to transform the European Union. It would be part of a general rising of the working classes across Europe. But Europe, the way Europe is constituted means that looks to me a complete pipe dream. You have to start somewhere, and that somewhere has got to be the UK, where there's still a party that's big enough and potentially radical enough to make those sorts of changes. In my view, there's more chance of there being a revolution in Europe than there is of actually getting changes through the European treaties to actually transform Europe in a way that we would like to see. And so, let me just conclude this way. Some parts of the left here seem to think that you can have a sort of pick and mix approach, that you can support bits of the Corbyn agenda while remaining inside the EU and supportive of the neoliberal policies that the EU stands for and has pushed down the throat of generally unsupportive people across the European Union. Frankly, I mean, I find that a difficult one to swallow, and the only conclusion that I can come to is that some of the professed radicalism of those people who say that they support the Corbyn agenda and radical policies in the UK is skin deep, that actually, rather like you know, their skinny lattes, their radicalism is froth, mainly. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Faizi Ismail, who teaches at SOAS, University of London, and is active in the Universities and College Union. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. So, I think the first thing we need to remember, amidst this crisis that's been forced upon us by the Tories, is that Leave and Remain voters have far more in common with each other than with most politicians in parliaments. I can understand why people would vote to remain if it meant being against the side of Farage, Johnson and Gove. But many of those on the Leave side were also voting against the establishment, the City of London, the CBI, and big business. And surely the majority of people on the march this past weekend are anti-racist and have progressive positions on a range of issues. This is also the case for the majority who voted Leave. I simply don't believe that most people who voted Leave are racist or right-wing or stupid, for that matter, as some in the mainstream media would have us believe. Many thousands of sincere people on that march find themselves in a situation where what they want can't come about except through a violation of democracy or popular sovereignty, and then again only under a leadership which is completely compromised by decades of austerity and war. I think the miscalculation of most of those who participated is that the central project of those who organized it, represented it, and funded it is to destroy Corbyn and to redirect the energies of the demonstrators into shoring up the status quo. And it was, of course, a deliberate attempt by the organizers to use extra-parliamentary methods to attack attack the left. And I think we need to be clear about that. But what did those on the march want? The real dividing line in society is not leave or remain. It's not the 52% and the 48%. It's between the 99% and the 1%. It's about whether you want a society of food banks, child poverty, knife crime, racism, a housing crisis, a mental health crisis, a financial crisis, or whether you want something different than the status quo. And for a lot of people who voted leave, this was an opportunity to give the government a kicking for failing on all of these issues, and we can hardly blame them for that. The second thing we need to remember is that this was an entirely Tory-made crisis. It stems out of decades of conflict within the Tory party over the question of Europe, over whether Britain was to be an Atlanticist or primarily European economy, which itself was a post-empire problem. It was David Cameron who made the ridiculous gamble, one, for the sake of Tory party unity, and two, to neutralize UKIP, which was taking votes from the Tories. He was confident that Remain would win and that his politics would be vindicated, and he could then introduce more austerity. But he lost. And Theresa May inherited this problem and made it worse and worse. All because they're more concerned with keeping their party together and maintaining more or less the status quo, Brexit or no Brexit, than with finding a solution that would make a difference to people's lives. It was framed as a right-wing debate, and the left position against the EU never really got a hearing. It became an argument between different sections of the right. And what is the left position against the EU? Of course, we can start with the deaths of thousands of migrants at the bottom of the Mediterranean. It was news that only just over 2,000 migrants died in 2018 compared to over 3,000 in 2017, according to the UNHCR. That's in part because the numbers of attempted crossings also declined by tens of thousands, and that's because the EU is funding Turkey, Libya, and other states, including military training, to stem the refugee flows. The purpose of Frontex, the EU's border agency, is precisely to prevent refugees from entering Fortress Europe. And the European Commission, remember, unelected and in practice largely unaccountable, proposes to triple funding for border management to almost 35 billion euros in the upcoming long-term budget. There's also, of course, growing links between the EU and NATO, institutionalized in the early 2000s through the European Security and Defense Policy, the Lisbon Treaty, and other agreements, which requires member states to raise their armament spending. And if all of that wasn't tragic enough, the EU has played an entirely undemocratic role in Greece, working with the IMF, the lender of last resorts, of structural adjustment fame, one of the most neoliberal institutions on the planet, to decimate Greece, impose austerity after 61% of the population voted against it in 2015, and which resulted in the strengthening of the far right and the transformation of what was once a militant party of the left to one that could be manipulated by the center, and that was Syriza. And I'm sure the EU would be very happy if the same thing happened in Britain. So the Remain and Reform position is untenable. What's happened is that Brexit has divided the Tories, it's divided the ruling class more generally, and produced a palpable sense of national crisis. And in this situation, the job of the opposition is to defeat the government and replace it in office, not reach across the benches in order to give it a lifeline. And the job of an opposition movement is not to help them solve the crisis on their terms, but to pave the way for a government that might actually be able to solve it. So we have to exploit the crisis at every possible opportunity. And finally, let's not forget that the Tories, the Labour rights and the liberal media, for them, Corbyn is the biggest threat that they face. An honest politician, here we have an honest politician with principles, and one which could become prime minister. I mean, no way. Let's not forget that Tom Watson, Jess Phillips, Chuka Umunna, and the rest of the right wing of Labour all want to help the Tories get an outcome that is acceptable to the establishment and strike a blow against Jeremy Corbyn at the same time. They stand in direct opposition to what most people want. And I think all that most people want is a governing party that represents them on some level. And what the right fears most is a politician who would actually start to change the balance of power in this country, to redistribute wealth, to focus on poverty and climate change and health and education and housing and the things that people really need, and to strengthen trade union rights and implement an industrial strategy to definancialize the economy, to regulate banking, to impose taxation, and so on and on. So we need a Corbyn government, and we need a movement that will deliver this. So what would unite the left? Not Leave or Remain, which merely parrots the divisions in the ruling class, not a second referendum, which would ultimately benefit the far right, who would exploit the failure of the politicians to abide by the original democratic vote, and not to mention throw a lifeline to the Tories, because it would make a general election less likely, not more likely, and not equating Corbyn with May, as some did on the march, which is astonishingly ignorant. What would unite the left and all progressives in this country is forcing a general election. This is the way that we can exploit the Tories' weakness, the monumental mess they've made of the situation, and have at least the chance of getting Corbyn into government. A general election would also shift the debate around issues that matter, and we can start imagining a way out of the status quo. This is a political crisis of the greatest proportions, but it's happening at a time when we actually do have an alternative. We have the most left-wing Labour leader in the history of this country. Corbyn represents the one chance in a generation or more. And if we waste it, the crisis for millions of people and the crisis for the left will be catastrophic. So let's concentrate on not what divides us, but what can bring us together. A general election and building a movement that can deliver it and defend a Corbyn government once in power. Thanks.
I'd now like to welcome Eddie Dempsey, who's a trade union activist and from RMT. About 20 years ago, I was on a platform with Tony Benn, Bob Crow from RMT, and Jeremy Corbyn. And I was on that platform nearly all day because I was the only woman speaking. So I was there from the beginning, almost right to the end till I got my turn to speak. So I'm really pleased to see the women here tonight. But before that, Eddie, please.
Yeah, thank you. So, I was born in 1982 on the day Thatcher declared war on the Falklands Islands. The paramedics in London were on strike on that day, and I was brought to hospital in a green goddess by the army because the paramedics were on strike, and I've never forgiven my mother for that insult. But that is the truth. I was born in South London to an Irish family. My dad was a seafarer out of the Port of London, which is now gone. I grew up in a council estate. We never saw a Labour politician. We barely saw decent work, any of us. Most of us turned to petty crime. Most of us turned to selling drugs or whatever we could do, fiddling a dole, try and get enough money together to look after our families. I ain't ashamed of it. It's something that a lot of us have had to do. But fundamentally, the institutions of the Labour movement that should have been available to me weren't there. It weren't until I joined the railway in 2007, 2008, just after my son was born, and I got my RMT membership card, that things changed. Because for the first time I had dignity. Before that, I'd worked on building sites, I'd worked in slaughterhouses, I'd worked in sales, I'd knocked on doors, I'd worked up on scaffolding without harnesses, without health and safety. I'd done whatever I could to get a few quid together, but for the first time with my union card, I had dignity, I had democracy in my workplace, I had fellowship. I was no longer just a wage slave, taking what I could, but somebody who had the ability through my own movement to make my voice heard on the matters that were fundamental to me and my class. And my trade union has always been opposed to the European Union, right from the inception of it. from every iteration of it, right back to the EEC. There was a resolution from our Glasgow number 5 branch that said our aims as a trade union cannot be met without a sovereign government with which to enact those policies. And that was back in the 50s. Now, my story is not that different to most working class people in this country. Previously, where we had industry, where people had dignity and jobs, neoliberalism the last 4 decades have robbed us, first of all, of those industries and our work, and second of all, of our institutions. You go to labour clubs around the country, now you see UKIP posters. You go to working class areas where people had work, now you see destitution. And it's those same people that have been robbed of work and then robbed of a voice in their own movement who are looked upon, really, by much of the left in this country as being stupid, as being ignorant, as being bigots, as being racists. We had a march in London not too long ago of a load of football hooligans. And I saw so many people on the left saying this is the 1930s all over again. This is the 1930s, they were saying. 1,500 or 15,000 people from northern towns with regional accents, and suddenly it's the 1930s all over again. But now look, we've had a couple of 100,000 people marching in London against democracy, but no one can see the threat there. So it makes me wonder. Now, I have never seen so many people suddenly concerned about workers' rights and jobs. I've never seen it. I've been standing on picket lines in this country for 10 years. I've been standing on picket lines in this country for 10 years, and I tell you what, it's only a recent event we see a Labour politician near us. Never mind any of these people that are marching up and down in London talking about workers' rights. In 2008, when the credit crunch hit, it made no difference to people like me. People going, we're going to lose jobs, everyone's skint. I thought, hang on, I'm skint every day of my life. Credit crunch is just like another cereal the kids on my estate couldn't afford to eat. Every time I open my front door, it's a credit crunch. And suddenly we're meant to be worried about the collapse of neoliberalism, what's going on around us. Now, we've always opposed the European Union as a trade union, and the entire British Labour movement did on those grounds. Because we've always, think of the tradition that we stand in the Labour movement. You go right back to the Putney debates, the Chartists, the suffragettes, Peterloo, General Ned Ludd and his army of redressers, the bold defiance, the 84 miners' strike, the 66 tightly knit group of politically motivated men. All of them had the same principles in their heart, and that is the democratic ownership of our government and of our industries and of our lives. And now people want us to sacrifice that entire movement on the altar of the EU. That somehow a bunch of technocrats that we don't elect somewhere else are going to be a defence against our own ruling class. It's nonsense. We've never been afraid of the Tories. We've beaten before and we'll do it again. And I tell you, the problem we've got in the left is, as the institutions of the working class and their jobs have been removed from around this country, some of their institutions been taken over by the Liberals. And that is a problem for us. Because I can tell you what, whatever you think about people that turn out for Tommy Robinson demos or any other march like that, the one thing that unites them people, beyond whatever other bigotry that's going on, is their hatred of the Liberal left. And they are right to hate them. They are correct. Because they are the people who have seen their industries taken away, who have captured their Labour Party, and are now talking to them like they're the scum of the earth. There's too many in the Labour Party right now. They've made a calculation that there's a certain section of the top end of the working class in alliance with people they calculate from ethnic minorities and the Liberals. That's enough to get them into power. And they believe that that alliance is all they need, that they can disregard all of the working class people in this country that have been driven away from the Labour movement by the neoliberals over the years. I'll tell you what, they do so at their peril. Because if we don't have the left organising and representing the working class in this country, then it's a dangerous day when somebody else does. And I tell you what, if it comes to a scrap in this country and the working class ain't on our side, the left is in deep, deep trouble. So we have got to be aware of that. Now, I knew we would win the vote. A lot of people didn't think we would. I mean, there's people in this room that attest. I called it. I said we'd win it, but I never thought we'd get out of it. Because it's like the Hotel California. You can vote to leave, but you never can. There has never been a democratic vote against any institution of the European Union that's been respected. The Dutch were turned over. The French were turned over. The Irish were turned over and then turned over again. Every time there's a vote, it's turned over in the interests of those that are in power. And I don't care what anyone says, I don't think there is this great, the difference between Leave and Remain is such a small thing that there's more things that unite us than there is that separates us. I don't believe that at all. I think there's a class divide in this country. There is a class divide in this country, and I tell you what, there is a lot of people out there who don't vote, who if you give them something to vote for, will get out of bed and come to the ballot box. And I tell you what, you can't give people lacklustre, lukewarm promises. If you give people something decent, they will turn out. This was the first election I've ever voted in that I felt like it was going to mean something. I've held my nose and voted Labour all of them years and couldn't see too much difference between them and the Tories, to be honest with you. And that's the truth. My trade union founded the Labour Party. We were kicked out of it. We just had an annual general meeting recently where our members, even though we're good friends with Corbyn, he's looked after us for years, did not trust going back into the Labour Party because of the likes of Tom Watson and all the rest of those fifth columnists in there who are trying to do us in. We have had enough of neoliberalism. What people want in this country is a decent house, they want a decent job, they want a health service, they want education for their kids, and they want a pension so they can retire in dignity. And every one of those things are in opposition to private ownership of the economy. So the only thing that matters in this country right now is who owns what. That is the question we have got to fight on. I'm sick of people coming from the left talking about all of these different types of issues. If we are not fighting on the fundamental basis of who owns our economy, then we are not engaged in left-wing activity as far as I can see it. And for the first time, we've got a Labour Party with a manifesto that I would gladly vote for. But I tell you what, it's worth so much bog paper inside the European Union. My industry, the railway, privatised under EU Directive 91/440. We cannot take it back into public ownership under the terms of the Fourth European Rail Package. I am blue in the face from explaining to neoliberals and pro-EU people, you cannot nationalise railways under this legislature, even when you show them the text of it, even when you show them in black and white. I mean, the EU write this stuff down for you. They're not hiding it. It's not a secret. They show you. Even when you tell them and you show them, they still don't believe you. The European Union is an empire. Why is it all of a sudden we cannot see that? Just like the Berlin Conference that carved up Africa prior to World War I, we've got the Cotonou Agreement, which shackles all the former colonies to the imperialist powers in the European Union. Ireland has become a warehouse for the likes of Amazon to offshore their taxes through sales into the European Union. The uneven economic development in the European Union means Ireland, a country that suffered colonialism and imperialism for most of its history, cannot industrialise. It is trapped forever as a warehouse for the likes of Amazon and the others. They must have their budget rubber stamped by people they can't elect before it even goes to their parliament. Every Irish man, woman and child in the country is a debt slave to the tune of €44,000 to bail out French and German banks, some of them with turnovers 20 times the size of the Irish economy. For what died the sons of Roisin? When Pearse stood on the steps of the GPO, was this what they fought for? Is this what our ancestors fought for? To take down one flag and put another flag up, just as imperial was the last one? And here we are. And you get people now, all of a sudden in this country, on the left, I have to say, with some honourable exceptions, they've somehow discovered there's a border in Ireland. I mean, I wish they'd come across it a little bit earlier on. All of a sudden, the border in Ireland, everyone becomes an expert on it. I can tell you now, there is nothing in the Good Friday Agreement that prevents a Brexit. The only thing that prevents any arrangements in Ireland to satisfy any deal is political will. And you have to see what is really going on. And that is those people on the other side of the table in Europe do not want to make a deal with us. I don't know why people can't see it. Any trade unionist in this country can tell you, you cannot negotiate a tea break with the employer if they don't want to negotiate with you. It's as simple as that. That's how it works. All it is to take no deal off of the table. Jesus Christ, if I went into my depot next week and said I'm negotiating the new rosters for the week, everyone, by the way, no deal's off the table, they'd hang me. I couldn't get to the end of the platform because it's nonsense and everyone knows it's nonsense. You cannot negotiate a deal with the other side if they don't want one. So we have got to leave the European Union, I believe, on WTO rules. It's the only way out. Let's get out of it. It's what we voted for. Now, people talk about... I've heard about a soft Brexit. I've heard about an hard Brexit. I've heard about a limp Brexit, a medium Brexit, a blue Brexit. I've never heard so many different types of Brexit. But it was quite helpful because the Prime Minister at the time wrote to all of us here with our own taxpayers' money, telling us we must stay in the European Union, by the way, and explained to us that meant leaving the institutions of the European Union, the customs union, the single market, the lot. That's what we voted for. Now we've got a parliament that does not want to leave the European Union. And it's like a charade. We've got all of these politicians, all of them pretending they want to leave the European Union, arguing with each other people who also don't want to leave the European Union. So what we do is a general election to replace those politicians with people who will deliver on a democratic vote of the people. But I'm telling you now, I've heard a lot of stuff over this past few years, and everything the Remain side has said has been wrong. They told us that if we voted Brexit, we'd be living in a permanent Tory-UKIP alliance. We said it will split the Tory party. We said David Cameron and Osborne will be in the bin. We've done it. We've got a surge in left-wing leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. It's a time for optimism. Everything we've said has been right and everything we've said has been wrong. So we've got to get out there, we've got to keep the fight going, because I tell you what, if you give people something worth getting out of bed for, they will. And that means we have got to take our industries back into public ownership. We have got to rebuild the industries that have been taken away from us. We've got to give people jobs and dignity and housing, and we cannot do that inside a neoliberal EU.
Bob Crow would have been proud of you. We're really pleased to welcome Grace Blakely now, who's the economics commentator at the New Statesman, and she's got a new book coming out on the financialisation of the British economy. Grace.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me this evening. It's great to see so many people here, especially given the kind of absolute horrors that are currently afflicting our political class. It's great to see people coming together to try and figure out how the left can take back control, I suppose, of what's going on in the Brexit process. And I kind of want to talk about what the discussion point was today, which is what can we do to kind of build socialism after Brexit. And thinking about that, it comes down to the question of what we need to do to build socialism. And as Eddie was just saying so eloquently, that means changing the nature of ownership. We've got this big divide, apparently, according to Tom Watson in the Labour Party, between democratic socialists and social democrats. Apparently, that is the thing that divides them. Well, I wish that is the issue that Tom spent most of his time talking about, because then we could have a real, genuine discussion about the difference between social democracy and democratic socialism. Social democracy, which is the kind of the preferred ideology of a big chunk of those on the right of the Labour Party, means kind of muting the inherent inequalities that arise from capitalism, a system of private ownership enforced by the state. Social democracy is perfectly permissible inside the EU. There are plenty of democratic states inside the EU, and most of them are going through a crisis of one form or another as capitalism slowly dies. But democratic socialism is something different entirely. It involves social, collective, cooperative ownership of the means of production, of the commanding heights of the economy, of the things that we need to use in order to produce and make things. It means that when the economy grows, everyone benefits because everyone has a stake. That represents a deep, fundamental, existential threat to the capitalist neoliberal order that has dominated all the economies in the global north for decades. And that is not permissible from within the institutions of the European Union. So going back to the question of what do we need to do to build socialism? What do we need to do to get there, to get to this point where ownership is shared across the whole economy, where everyone has a stake in economic growth, and where kind of decisions are made democratically by workers and by people who are accountable to them. And the thing that we have to look at today, the thing that's most important and has always been most important on the left, is a really kind of hard-headed analysis of power. Where is the power, and what do we have to do to take the people with the power down? And if you look at our economy today, power is concentrated amongst a particular section of capital, and that is finance capital. Those are the people in the City of London, they're the people running the banks, they're the people who are managing our pensions, they're the people who are managing property, and they're actually distributed throughout the whole system of organising the capitalist economy, throughout our firms, throughout our state, throughout all the major institutions that govern the British economy. And paving the way for democratic socialism requires taking them down. Thankfully, they've already done quite a lot to screw themselves over. So we're coming at them from a slightly weakened position. And actually, the position that we find ourselves in today, 10 years after the biggest crisis since the Great Depression, is a crisis of the growth model that these people have foisted upon us for the last 50 years. We are living through a crisis of finance-led growth. And for those of us who are familiar with our Marx, we know that crises are moments of massive opportunity if we can take hold of them to upend the systems that created those crises in the first place. And doing that today means issuing a massive challenge to the finance sector, to the financiers, to the institutional investors, to the speculators that govern our economy and have done so for the last 50 years. And doing that requires taking on finance. As I said a while ago at Labour Party conference, Labour needs to treat the banks the way Thatcher treated the unions, because you cannot build a new order if the power relations that sustain the old one still exist. We need to socialise our financial system, and we need to do so in the interests of working people. And I conveniently have a book coming out which discusses all of these things, so you'll be able to read about it in much more detail in September. But I'll kind of go over the highlights now. So we need to do, I think, 3 sets of things. Firstly, we need to constrain the existing private financial system. And that requires a massive increase in its regulation. It requires doing things like wonky term macro-prudential policy, which requires constraining lending, limiting what banks can do, limiting what shadow banks can do, limiting what investors can do. And it also requires doing things like implementing capital controls. And this is something that you can do in a number of different ways. It's not like going back to the days when you're only allowed to take a certain money out of the country. We can do something like implement a currency transactions tax, which means that, you know, when a Labour government comes to power and all the wealthy people start freaking out and saying, I'm going to move my money to Panama, we say, fine, you can take your 10 million out of the country, but we'll have 9 million of it in tax. And that's another way that we could think about doing capital controls. All of this stuff, again, perfectly permissible according to the kind of international architecture that has been built up around the financial system since the crash, not permissible within the EU. The second thing we need to do is, once we've constrained private finance, we'll get the threat. Think of this in similar terms to the Ridley plan. Thatcher comes in, has this plan to take on the miners. She knows that they're going to strike. She knows it's going to cause disruption, so she has a plan to deal with it. We take on the banks. We know that they're going to strike. They'll stop lending, and we know that they're going to flee. They'll try and run away. So we need to have a plan to be able to deal with that. And the first thing we need to do is set up alternatives. So we need to set up a public retail banking system that can provide all services to ordinary people and to businesses with kind of good rates that will allow the economy to grow and will direct investment to strategic parts of the economy, particularly that will promote the growth of kind of sustainable, development. And then we need to make sure that we're doing something to deal with the massive the kind of parasite that has existed in the British economy that has kind of been foisted on us by the finance sector, which is the huge amount of debt that we are currently living under. That is, really, it's not just kind of sapping economic growth and sapping the life out of our economy. It's a way of exerting power. Because debt poverty, debt peonage is a fundamentally different experience to kind of poverty in the context of low wages. You cannot organise against a payday lender. You can't organise against a bank that's charging you usurious rates of interest. It's a way of individualising poverty and therefore keeping people in a subservient position. That debt needs to be cancelled. And that's something that a Labour government has to do as soon as it gets into government. That debt needs to be refinanced, and some of it just needs to be cancelled outright. And we need a longer-term plan to socialise capital in the economy. So Labour already has something of a plan to do this. We've got the National Investment Bank, but that is not nearly far enough. And actually, the way that the National Investment Bank's been brought about the particular model, which is that it kind of on-lends to other banks, so it creates money and then that money goes to other banks, has been done so that it doesn't breach EU state aid rules. Because a state bank lending at competitive interest rates to businesses directly in the economy would be a breach of EU state aid rules. And over the longer term, we need to make sure that our collective wealth, whether that's our pensions wealth, our property wealth, is not being managed and controlled by the private sector for private profit, but is actually being controlled collectively and democratically by the people of this country in order to boost growth and actually get us out of the biggest existential crisis that humanity's ever faced in history, which is dealing with climate change. At the moment, we've seen capital being directed into sections of the economy that are completely inefficient, and there's absolutely no incentives to deal with that massive crisis. It's only people coming together and actually taking back control of these things that will see any progress towards dealing with climate change. So as I said, most of this stuff, this is what we need to do. This is the kind of, first term stuff that a Labour government needs to do to deal with the power of finance capital and start socialising investment in its place. And most of it is not possible within the EU. First, you've got state aid rules, which prevent, effectively, governments from kind of strategically allocating capital across the economy. And second, you've got restrictions, the provisions around capital mobility, which means that states can't implement capital controls and there cannot be any restrictions on the ability of capital to move around the EU and to move in and out of the EU. And that is the human right of capital flight that has been institutionalized in all of our economic institutions. And actually, it's something that facilitates imperialism. It does so within the EU, and it also does so at the global level. So you've seen, before the financial crisis, when you had these massive property bubbles and bubbles in speculative assets in the financial systems of the US and the UK, a lot of the capital that was flowing in there was flowing out of other countries that could have used that to industrialise and to develop their economies. Instead, it was sucked in to the vortexes that are the City of London and Wall Street. And dealing with capital mobility is actually an incredibly important part of any anti-imperialist strategy. Not to mention the parasitical role that the City of London and its network of tax havens plays on the global economy. You know those posters that HSBC have put up all around London saying, "You are London." These people have done, they've facilitated money laundering on the part of Mexican drug cartels. They're implicated in a whole host of horrific scandals that they've somehow managed to just completely brush off with every tiny fine that they're issued by this government. These institutions, they have a cosmopolitan image, and actually what they are imperialist, neo-colonial institutions that have absolutely no place, not only in any socialist government, but even liberals looking at the things that these institutions have done should think twice about whether or not they'd want to be on the same side as these guys. So, what next, given where we are now? We are obviously at a moment of complete and utter crisis. And for me, Brexit came at a time of systemic breakdown. We're enduring a period of institutional breakdown. We are living through a moment of crisis. And Brexit is in many ways a symptom of the death of the old order. You have centrist politics that's governed an essentially stable economic model between the kind of 80s and 2007. And that was premised upon the fact that no one was questioning what was going on in the economy. We all said, it's all fine, leave the management of it to the technocrats in the government and in the EU. They know what they're doing. Let's just leave them and leave them to do that and everything will be fine. History is over. Capitalism has won. The best we can hope to do is just to kind of tinker around the edges and redistribute to alleviate some of the massive inequalities that this system created. And that all completely evaporated. That confidence completely evaporated in 2007. So not only have we got the kind of centrist class, the liberal order, terrified and kind of looking amongst itself, thinking, what on earth is going on? What can we do? Why is everyone suddenly so angry at us? We have an insurgent movement. We have insurgent movements in states all around the global north, and in fact, all around the world. And there is this level of anger, not just about the fact that they are worse off than they were 10 years ago and they look set to get worse off, but the fact that that has come about as a result of politicians refusing point blank to listen to them, to listen to their experience of the economy and actually say, you know, GDP is growing, but I'm not getting any better off. Well, that's fine. You're just not, you know, you're not engaging in economic growth well enough. And those are revolutionary conditions. The question is whether or not that anger is going to be directed into actual transformation that will support and help those people, or whether it will be directed into a kind of fit of fascist hysteria where working people kind of turn against one another. And let's not, you know, question that. That is what the elite would choose when it came down to it. If it was a choice between socialism and fascism, the elite would throw their weight behind fascism. That is something that was made abundantly clear when the financial press put their weight behind Bolsonaro in Brazil. So we are, let's not question this, we are at a moment of crisis. Even if we weren't at a moment of economic crisis, we're in a moment of environmental crisis. And what we do next will determine the course of history. What we do next, the institutions that we build in the wake of the collapse of the old ones, will determine what happens for the next several decades. And Brexit has happened during this time, and it's not a coincidence, it's not an annoyance or a distraction from the socialist cause. It is actually fundamentally a symptom of that anger, and it's a symptom of the fact that we failed to direct that anger where it belongs, which is against the 1%, which is against people who live off wealth rather than people who live off work. It's against the elites in this country that are seeking to use this to divide us, to distract from what is their real threat to them, which is a democratic socialist government. And we need, as I said at the beginning, we need to, pardon the turn of phrase, but take back control of the narrative on this. We need to point out that the EU is a representative of the transnational capitalist class, and actually say that, you know, building the kind of socialist agenda that we would want to build can only happen outside of the European Union. That means we need to push for a general election, first and foremost, as all the other panellists have said here, but we also need to be realistic about what we can ask for. At this current juncture, we don't look like we're going to get a general election. We don't look like we're going to get a second referendum, thank God. And we don't look like, actually, we're going to get a no deal. So we have a series of choices. Basically, you know, the political class will do everything they can to try and make sure that Brexit does not happen. And for me, the most important thing over the next couple of months is to make sure that we get our foot out the door. We need to make sure that we leave. We actually leave. And that may not end up being on the terms we want. We may end up having to, because the Labour leadership and the Labour Party has made a series of what I would argue are strategic errors, it may end up that we end up leaving in the customs union or something along those lines. But the most important thing we need to do is to get our foot out the door and make sure that the establishment doesn't use this absolute constitutional chaos in order to make us stay in the institutions of the European Union. Then, when we come into government, when we have a socialist government, everything that we're saying right now is going to be proven right. Because as soon as a Corbyn government gets into power, it is going to face an onslaught from not just the European Union, but all the institutions, the international institutions that support neoliberalism all around the world. And we need to be prepared for that by building a new international order. That has always been such a central part of socialist projects all around the world. I've been doing some work recently with the UN, looking at how we might build a kind of new form of multilateralism, a new kind of Bretton Woods that constrains capital mobility, that supports development in the global south, and that resists imperialism and supports the rights of workers all over the world. And that is simply not possible within the framework of the European Union, an imperialist, neo-colonial institution, or within the framework of the international financial institutions, each of which works on the premise of $1, one vote, rather than one country, one vote. Labour needs to be prepared to build up new international institutions that represent workers all around the world, that represent their interests, that promote restrictions on financial capital, that support a Green New Deal, and that actually help to build socialism in every single country and every single state all over the planet. And that is simply something that we cannot do within the institutions of the European Union. Thanks very much.
Now, our final speaker today is Kostas Lapavistas, who beat Grace because his book's on sale here now. You planned ahead much better, Grace, there.
Sorry.
Kostas is an economist at the University of London, and he was an MP in Greece for Syriza, but didn't stay for long when things changed. So I'd like you to welcome Kostas.
Hello, good to see so many people. After such a week, what a time it has been. Actually, more than 1 week, 2 weeks of what? Of confusion, of indecision, of loss of command by the government, but loss of command of the country in Europe as well, being told what to do, relying on others to solve these problems. Lack of preparedness, manifest lack of preparedness. What a week. Why? Why is that? Why are we in this state? Is it because Brexit is so inherently difficult to bring about? Is this some kind of human institution that is beyond human intervention? That once you're in it, that's it, you're done. You're there forever. Is that why? No, I don't think so. I'll give you 3 reasons why we're in this position. The first is, of course, the most important reason, and it's a social reason. The British ruling class, the British establishment, does not want Brexit. That is the thing to bear in mind at all times. The City of London, big business, big capital in this country, does not want Brexit. It hears Brexit and it gets an anorexic attack, or an anaphylactic attack, or whatever it gets. Right? It doesn't want Brexit. Why? Because it's perfectly happy with present arrangements within the EU. It's perfectly happy with the EU. It doesn't want to leave. If it wanted to leave, you can take it from me, it would have been out by now. Or it would have been dealt with. There would have been a plan. There would have been a plan agreed across the country. That's the first point. The second point is that the British political system evidently malfunctions from top to bottom. It has been cut off from the people. It doesn't work democratically. Democracy malfunctions. Actually, there's a big problem with democracy in this country. Parliament does not want Brexit. It doesn't want Brexit, unlike the people. And Parliament, if you talk to anybody who knows how Parliament works at the moment, talks only to big banks and big capital at the moment. It is impervious to any kind of other argument. When trade unions approach Parliament right now to have an argument with the MPs and so on, they don't listen. The only people they listen to are banks and big business. And what do they tell them? No Brexit. No Brexit, that means Brexit. And the Parliament reproduces it. No Brexit. No Brexit, a majority in favor of that. The third reason I can give you, and it's a reason that all of us have lived through the last 2-3 years, is that the Brexit debate in this country, because we've had a Brexit debate of sorts since the referendum, the Brexit debate in this country has been dominated by what I can only call the silly wing of the Tory party. In other words, the far right wing of the Tory party. And the debate, as a result, has been ridiculous, because these people have interpreted Brexit as a search for a trade deal. So you talk to them, and if you listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg or someone of that ilk, what's the point of Brexit? The point of Brexit is to have a rerun of the anti-corn laws, to lift the corn laws. Britannia will rule the waves again. Richard Cobden bestrides the land. Which century do they live in? What is this about? Because, of course, in truth, the British establishment, big business and big banks, are perfectly happy with the trade arrangements they've got. They don't need Jacob Rees-Mogg to give them better arrangements. They're perfectly happy with the arrangements they've got in the EU, and they want to maintain them. The single market fits the needs of British big business and big banks. They don't want any better trade arrangements. They're perfectly good for them. And so, for the left, and many of the rest of us, Brexit has been interpreted as a damage limitation exercise. Yes, I can see, of course. From the perspective of big business, it is a damage limitation exercise, and that has been reproduced by the left and the others. But you see, the real issue here is this. Brexit was never primarily about trade. The left has never managed to get that point across. Brexit was never primarily about trade. That's not the promise of Brexit. Brexit was always about economic and democratic renewal in this country. It's the promise of renewal, of structural transformation, of a deep change, of changing the balance of social and class forces in this country in favor of the poor and in favor of the working class. And of course, big business never wanted that. Never wanted that. That's why we've had the ridiculous debate we've had so far. That's why the country feels at a loss. But how would Brexit bring about that change? Let me give you a little bit of some substance to this. How can Brexit still deliver that deep change that we want, that deep transformation that we want? The first observation here is that the country doesn't work. We all agree on it. The country malfunctions. All you've got to do is take the train from Edinburgh to London. You've got concrete evidence that the country doesn't work, never mind from elsewhere. So it needs a reboot. We need a reboot. What kind of reboot? I'll give you 5 points of how the country can be rebooted. The first thing is, and I think we would all agree on it, we need an industrial strategy. We need an industrial strategy run by some kind of public authority, not an industrial strategy run by big business, but run by some kind of public authority that will do what? It will definancialize the country. We will start with definancialization. The City of London is too big for the size of the British economy. It's unbalanced. The economy is unbalanced. We need to reduce the size of the City of London and increase the size of manufacturing, industry, and so on proportionately to create good jobs, to have productivity growth, to have an economy that works in the interests of its people. So that will not happen without an industrial strategy, and in particular, that will not happen in a green direction without an industrial strategy. That's point number one. Point number two, which follows from the first. Can you have an industrial strategy of this type while leaving the property regime in the country the same? You can't. You need to change the balance of property in favor of public property in key areas, in transport, the railways, in energy, in water, in a whole host of areas. We need public property. We need public running of these areas with the public interest in mind, right? Properly run with the public interest in mind. So that's the second thing we need to do. Once you put that into the mix, then you realize industrial strategy with public ownership, someone has to be financing that. Someone has to be making sure the finances work. The current financial system, if you looked at it closely recently, do you think they can finance this kind of arrangement? Never. We need public intervention in finance. We need public banking. We need public banking institutions. We need public long-term investment institutions, not simply what the Labour Party is proposing, but far more ambitious than that. And we need capital controls. As Grace was saying, we need capital controls. We need to stop people from taking their money in and out of the country and speculating on the back of the rest of us. So we need that kind of strategy too. Once you've done that, 2 more points and I'll come to an end, you also need to consider what's going to happen with income and wealth redistribution. The country is ridiculously unequal, embarrassingly so. There are people who need help in order to do their weekly shopping, and people who live in a different world, in the stratosphere of the rich in this country, even as we speak. We need to do something about that, and do something about it quickly and presently. And last, far from least, the welfare system doesn't work. We know we've got a crisis of housing, a crisis of education, and a crisis of health, the health system. We need intervention. We need to put them on a different footing. We need to make sure that they deliver to people what they need and what they have a right to, because they pay the taxes and they work towards it. In other words, we need what I would call a socialist strategy. This is basically a socialist strategy. It's a strategy to change the balance of forces in the interests of labor and against capital in this country. And I ask you, can you do that in the EU? Can you do that in the EU? I only need to pose the question to show how ridiculous the question is. Of course you cannot do that in the EU. It's impossible to do it in the EU for reasons that Eddie pointed out previously, or Grace pointed out previously. State aid rules, public procurement rules, nationalization rules, all that will stop you from having these policies that we need to intervene. Not to mention, of course, freedom of capital flows. Do we have evidence that this is the case? We do. We have evidence from Greece. Syriza. Syriza tried some of these things in the early days of intervention. You know who stopped it? You know who the biggest problem is with state aid rules, public procurement rules, nationalization rules. A lot of people get this wrong. They think that if we try and do something like that, intervene, the EU will come and tell us, no, you can't do that. That's not how it works. If you try and intervene in the railways, or if you try to intervene whatever else, in water and so on, the domestic interest, the British interest that is actually hurt by the intervention, the people, in other words, who've got private interest in this, they make profits out of this, will be the first in the queue. They will go to the EU and they will say, guess what this government is doing? It's hurting us. And it's hurting us by bypassing EU regulation. Please intervene. And they will intervene. That's how it's going to happen. That's how it's going to be. That is what will stop socialist intervention because of the EU. It will not be the EU first. It will be the domestic interest that will seek recourse to the EU, and the EU will oblige. And that's even before mentioning the political opposition. Let's suppose you get a socialist government, a Labour government, with this program, which it announces, and the British people vote for it, and I believe that there is a majority in the country in favour of that. Do you really think that the Commission, the European Central Bank, the European Court of Justice and so on will look at this with equanimity? Do you really think that they will say, oh, okay, let the Brits try something socialist? Do you seriously believe that? We experienced that in Greece. Syriza was elected. It put forth a program which wasn't particularly radical back in 2015. We had the unrelenting hostility of the European Union until the leadership of Syriza caved in. Until it caved in and surrendered. Then Tsipras became their best friend, of course, because he'd surrendered. That's what you can expect from the European Union if you get a radical left government in this country trying to bring a program like this in place. So Brexit is about the possibility of that kind of radical change. I haven't got much time, so I'll push on. Brexit is also about democracy, I will say. Not only about economic renewal, but also about democratic renewal in the country. It's about democracy for reasons that I've already pointed out. Democracy has hollowed out in this country. It doesn't work. The parliament clearly doesn't represent the interests of the people. But democracy has also hollowed out in the European Union. There is a clear divergence between the institutions of the European Union, how they work, what they do, and the peoples of Europe. It's clear, it's manifest. All you've got to do is look at the list of institutions, the Council, the Commission, Parliament, Eurogroup, EMS, ECB. They're institutions designed to be impervious to the popular will. They're designed in that way. They're designed to be distant from the popular will, untouched by it, because the Parliament is not a real Parliament. Because Commission is not a real Commission. They appear to be so, but they're not. You can vote all you like. Your will doesn't reach those levels because they were designed in that way. And that is all we need to say in order to give the lie to the argument that we hear about remain and reform. Reform? Where exactly will you start? Which commission will you begin with? Or rather, which committee will you begin with? How will you do it? I've been desperately trying to read a single program, concrete program of reform. I challenge you to find one. Please send it to me. I'll be forever in your debt. I have heard it many times. We will remain in reform. How will you reform? What will you do? If you find an answer, let me know, because there isn't one. No one among the people I've heard come up with this line has actually told me how they're going to reform it. And you know why? Because it's irreformable. You can't reform something which you can't reach, something over which you've got no power. You can't reform it. It's actually impervious to reform. It's designed in that way. You can only break with it. Only by breaking with it can you reboot democracy. And I'll come to one last thing about racism. Because really, I've ended up to here with racism and the Brexit being a racist thing and all of us being somehow racist, even when, it's, you know, some of us, well, others are from elsewhere, but somehow we're all implicitly racists. I'll tell you one thing about the EU. The EU is not a beacon of free movement. of labour. It's not something which allows people to travel and cross borders freely. It's not a defender of that. It's not the embodiment of that. That is one dimension of it, and that's the internal dimension, because that suits big business in Europe. What matches that is the other side of it, which is absolute forbidding of free movement for people who come from outside the European Union. That's not accidental. One goes with the other. To have the free movement of labour within the EU that the big business wants, you must stop it from the outside. So you must stop Africans from coming in, you must stop Middle Eastern people from coming in, you must stop Asians from coming in, and so on. They go together. The EU is not a paragon of the free movement of labour. Far from it. Actually, it is very, very hard on this. And against the interests of working people across the world. We've got every means at our disposal as a national entity to have a policy on immigration that will be open, liberal, that will grant rights to EU people living in this country, rights to remain if they've been here, if they've made a life here, and the Tory government is keeping them on tenterhooks at the moment, that will give reciprocal rights to British people in other countries and so on. We don't need the EU for that. We have every lever at our power to deliver that. And I want to finish by saying what to do now. We're in a mess, right? You look at Parliament, we're in a mess. There's a list of choices. I don't know what the Parliament will do. Everything is still on the table. Literally, everything is still on the table. But you can go down the list and you can exclude things. You can do it that way. May's deal, rubbish. Rubbish, why? Because it keeps the country locked in the customs union. And it doesn't allow you to do the things we want to do with state aid and so on, because it accepts every regulation of the EU on that. Norway Plus, you have to be an idiot. Norway Plus is worse than what we've got right now. You might as well stay in the EU. Norway Plus is actually keeps all the constraints on you and no rights, no say, nothing. I mean, who in their right mind will support this and come across as a serious politician or as a serious technocrat? Second referendum, have they thought it through? Do they know what's going to happen? Have they any comprehension of what's going to happen if they go to working class areas and start talking about these things and trying to push for a second referendum? Long extension with Euro elections. So the country will be engaged in discussing Brexit, and meanwhile the parties will field Euro elections asking people to vote for membership of the European Parliament. I mean, that will be the epitome of absurdity. So what's left? No deal. That's what's left. No deal is left. No deal, which is not what we wanted in the first place. We should have had a deal. It was perfectly possible to have a deal. The reason why we're in that position is because the British ruling class doesn't want Brexit. Is no deal such a disaster, really? Why is it such a disaster? On what grounds? Apparently it's it's going to be the biggest blow to Britain since the Luftwaffe was bombing London. Why? It's going to change the relative prices of imports and exports. That's what it's going to do. It's going to make some exports more expensive, and it's going to change some imports and some exports. Exports will be troubled, and some imports will change their prices. Yes, it's going to be a blow to industry. So what you should do is support exporters. If exporters are hurt, you give them credit help, and you give them tax help. You lower the tax they pay so that you balance the costs. I mean, we've known that states can do that. You know, what's the big deal? What's the big problem? What is the biggest disaster since Hitler was, ruling Europe? No deal is perfectly manageable. It's not something we would have chosen, but it is manageable. It gives us a clean exit. It allows us to start afresh, and it delivers a blow at the City of London and the big business in this country. And that is the starting point for any social transformation. So that, I think, we should be staying loud and clear and hopeful to see in the coming days. Thank you.
I'm going to take questions now. I'm going to take 5 questions to start with. So if anybody would like to indicate, would you say who you are, if you wouldn't mind, please? So, young man there. Hey. Sorry. young woman there, person here, woman here, and woman behind her, please. Okay.
Hello, my name is Gibran, and my question to the people who are talking about no deal is, what would your solution be to the border issue in Northern Ireland?
Okay, thank you. So border in Northern Ireland. Yeah, one behind.
Hi, Ella Whelan from Spiked. I'm really pleased to hear a defence of no deal. It's not something that you hear very often in other political arenas. But what I want to challenge some members of the panel on is the big elephant in the room with the red rosette on it. I mean, the idea that the Labour Party would ever support a no deal or would ever enact the kind of Brexit that I think we all want to see in this room is a fantasy, is a pipe dream. I mean, Brexit asks the Labour Party a question. Do you side with the middle-class Remain supporter base, or do you go with the Leave supporting working classes? And it's answered that question loud and clear. The Labour Party is split between how to stop Brexit, either by a second referendum or revoking it, or by some kind of a soft sellout deal. So why won't you let go of this idea that the Labour Party is going to give you Brexit? Because there's no way that it will.
Thank you for that.
Hello, I'm Alex. I was just wanting to ask, how does no deal happen now? Because nobody wants it. I mean, most people here want it. I want it. But like Ella was saying, Labour don't want it. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't even want it. I don't see how we actually get to no deal. And my question is, how can we actually get there?
Hi, my name is Felicity de Motta. I'd just like to say I think the scenario is quite clear. We're at a watershed, and we either take right or we take left. And it's time in our history that I don't think we'll see again. But that's not my question. My question is, how can you justify a no deal, or why do you think that the extreme right want a no deal? How can you justify doing exactly what the extreme right do? I know you can both want similar things, but for different reasons, but I still don't understand how no deal will help a Corbyn government or this country.
Okay, thank you. I will take one more because somebody, person right at the back there, had kindly said she'd already had her question asked. So thank you.
Hello, yeah. I would love to see all the things that The Economist was talking about. Taking over the banks.
Could you stand up because we can't hear so well? Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, so everything The Economist said I'm really up for. I'd like to see all those changes. But we have to put this in terms of the balance of class forces. At the moment, we only have 5 million people in trade unions. Not all those people are in workplaces that are recognised. They don't have shop stewards. To get those changes, we still have the power of the state with a monopoly on violence. The number of strike days that we have at the moment is really low. So, much as I'd like to see those changes, I really can't see it happening in the current period.
Okay, thank you. So, border in Northern Ireland. Anybody like to take that?
Yeah, so, look, here's the thing. We've got a Tory government in this country because of British claim to sovereignty in Ireland. That's a fact that people need to get into their heads in the British Labour movement. The TUC and the Labour Party, if it's serious about democracy here or anywhere else, has got to come to terms with that historic problem and has got to become a persuader for Irish unity and freedom. The Unionists in Northern Ireland act as a reserve for the Conservative Party here, and it poisons democracy in both countries. And that's the reality of it. Now, the border question in Ireland itself around Brexit, there are elements of regulatory alignment that is hinted to within the Good Friday Agreement, but none of those issues are a matter of making Brexit impossible in the context of Ireland's petition. It's a matter of political will, not a matter of treaty. And the reason these issues are not being sorted out is because, unfortunately, the Irish border presents itself as quite a convenient prop for politicians in this country. Shamefully, most of them on the left who want to use it as a political prop to argue against Brexit. And it's quite shameful because you know, throughout all the historic problems that the partition of Ireland has engendered in both countries, you know, all of a sudden now, I've never heard so many experts about a border in Ireland. And I'll tell you what, there weren't too many politicians that had come near anyone who wanted to get rid of that border a few years ago. So here we are. It's a matter of political will, not anything that's in any treaty that prevents us leaving the European Union.
Thank you. Anyone else on that? Or? No. Okay, fine. I think that was a fine answer. What we have got are questions about no deal, the Labour Party and role of the TUC. So what about the no deal?
How can we end up with no deal? We can still end up with that by default. If you look at the political elite at the moment, no one seriously wants it. Even the Tories the far right of the Tory party, not many among them really truly want it. It's a political argument within the Tory party to apply pressure. But you can end up with it because of where they brought us. I went down the list, and just as you exclude one thing and another thing and another thing, they do the same. And there's no majority for anything that's clear in Parliament at the moment. If there's no majority for anything in Parliament, you can end up with no deal, by default. Things like that have happened in history. So it won't happen because we will make it happen. We're minor and marginal to this. But in Parliament, it could easily happen right now. It cannot be excluded. So that's how we might end up there in practice, by exclusion of other options. Because that's how they brought it. That's how they... Let me put it other ways. It is the least... there are worse options for both parties right now than no deal. Within the logic, so we might end up with no deal in the end. Which brings us to the question of the right and what we are saying. From the very beginning, this has been an issue with us, because we came out in favor of Brexit from the left. And the argument we've had to put up with is, how can you possibly be arguing this when it's the right that is arguing for Brexit? And the left has done what it's done. Much of the blame for that must go with the left, which should have been active, changing the debate and actually presenting it in a different light, and allowing us to have real arguments about what we can do along the lines that are summed up, and have had a different public debate in this country. But we haven't. We haven't. The left has been what it has, and we are where we are. Confronted with this situation, we've got to make a hard decision and hard choice. Here we're not actually determining which way things are going to go. It doesn't depend on us, right? It doesn't depend on us. It is for us to judge what option gives us best opportunities, opens up more scope for intervention, radical intervention from the left. And of all the options that I see, for the reasons that I pointed out, the one that gives, of all the Brexit options that I see, the one that gives us best opportunities is the no deal option, unfortunately. It's not what I would have chosen. It's not what I would have supported. We should have had a deal. It is their fault for bringing us to this position. It is Theresa May's fault for bringing us to this position, but that's where we are. That's where we are. That's what we're confronted with. And in terms of real options on the table, that's the one that will give us an opportunity to shift things in the direction in which we want to go. Will it be in the direction of the right? That's a matter of struggle. That's a matter for us to fight and to shift it the way we want to go. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not scared of it. Let's have it. Let's see it on the ground. Let's see it in the workplaces and in the streets. Let's have the class struggle around it. And let's see who wins.
Grace wants to.
Yeah, sure. So I think that right now the most important thing that we've got to do is to chart a course towards, in this order, a Labour government, and then fully leaving all the institutions of the European Union. And it's a question of how we get from here to there. I'm not of the opinion, as the kind of, I think the lady said over there, that we need a Labour government to get us Brexit, and the reason we shouldn't be supporting Labour is that they won't do that. I'm of the opinion that we need a Labour government in order to fundamentally effect a transformation of wealth and ownership in the economy, and actually figuring out the way to do that is the most important strategic fight that we have on our hands at the moment. And I don't think a no deal would necessarily be bad. You know, you're talking about a couple of percentage points of tariffs on imports. It would affect some industries more than others, but it would be easy to deal with that through industrial strategy. What would be a disaster would be a Tory Brexit, because they would use it to turn us into a kind of low tax, low regulation haven off the coast of Europe for as long as they were in power after it happened. That's the big problem that we've got to face up to. So, you know, if the problem is Labour government then leaving the EU, which would facilitate social transformation, and I'll come on to the gentleman in the back's question later, then we need to think about what the options are on the table now and how we get to hit from here to there. So we've got Theresa May's deal, as Costa said, terrible. Second referendum, equally terrible. And by the way, none of these things have a majority in Parliament anyway. We've got soft Brexit, which does have a majority in Parliament, although it's not what we want. We've got no deal, which doesn't have a majority in Parliament and probably isn't what we want. And we've got revoking Article 50. Now, when all those things come down to it, the democratic things, so second vote and GE, are off the table. We'll come down to the line, as Costas was saying, and we'll be facing up to the option of a no deal. And at that point, Parliament will opt in one way or another to revoke Article 50. They will not let us come out with a no deal. And that's the big worry that we've got to face up to. For me, the strategic question at the moment is what we do next. And like what I see as the best, well, the only move, not the best move by any stretch of the imagination, is just to say we're negotiating a way to get out of the EU, even if that is remaining in the customs union. We then wait this out, you know, and actually get back to talking about what we should be talking about, which is the kind of economic malaise and just complete and utter chaos that we're living through at the moment. We get a Labour government, and at that point, we've got one foot out of the door, and when they try and stop us from doing what we want to do, we have a democratic mandate to say, we're leaving because you're preventing us from doing what we want to do. And we're doing so with a Labour government on our terms in a way that will allow us to absorb any of the economic impact that would create. And actually, I know that is the strategy of, I wouldn't be too down on the Labour Party. Whilst its most, vociferous voices are out there constantly defending a people's vote, there are lots of people behind the scenes who are very, very sympathetic to this and who actually want to see us leave the EU. And will actually work to make sure that happens when they're in government. Why are they hiding? I think basically because I think the main reason that they're hiding is because we haven't got political cover. Well, because we haven't. They're cowards. They won't come at the time when it matters. Yeah, that's probably. How do you expect?
Can you? That's.
Institute policies in favour of the working class if they won't back a vote that was predominantly voted for by the working class.
Thank you for that.
I mean, I don't necessarily buy this whole thing that like the 52% are the working class and the 48% are the middle and upper class. I think this is a different cleavage, and this is a different divide than the one that we want to be fighting on. It's a divide between people who see themselves as open and cosmopolitan and happy-go-lucky, and those who don't see themselves in those terms. And actually, the divide we want to be fighting on is that between the 1% and the 99%, and that is, Brexit is actually preventing us from doing that. But when it comes down to why they haven't done this, I mean, I agree. I think they screwed up. I don't disagree with you on that front. I don't think that the Labour leadership have done anything that I would have wanted them to do. And I think that was partly because they didn't think that if they'd done that it would have basically decimated the entire project. And part of the reason that they thought that is because a lot of us weren't out there in the media, in the movement, kind of having these debates and these discussions. I talk to people all the time. When I speak at these events, young people come up to me afterwards and they're like, I never knew that the EU was bad. Like, they just haven't been exposed to any of these ideas at all. We haven't had this debate and this discussion. And we're having it now, and that's great, but it is a bit too late. We need to be, outriders and the rest of the movement needs to be pushing the leadership to be able to do all of this stuff. And this actually links to the gentleman's question at the back, which is how do we make sure that when Labour gets into government, they do anything radical? And it's the same issue of parliamentary socialism that Labour parties in this country have faced since the Labour Party was created. And it requires, you know, that you're going into the state, you're going up against a set of institutionalised forces that will attempt to drag you down. You need to have a powerful movement behind you. You need to have a powerful social movement. You need to have a powerful labour movement. And those need to be integrated into the party in ways that can ensure that they put pressure on MPs to the extent that makes sure that they don't become beholden to the interests of finance capital. That means using the levers of the state as well to then re-empower those forces. So, you know, repealing all the anti-union legislation and kind of re-empowering our unions, undoing all the stuff that Thatcher did, at the same time as taking down the interests within the state and around the state that would seek to upend that project. And, you know, whilst it's not going to be perfect, and whilst the domain of electoral politics is not the only domain in which this struggle needs to be fought, having control over the state matters, because capitalism is a state-backed, state-led project. It is not just free markets. Free markets don't exist. Markets are created by states. And having control over the ways in which those markets are created is essential for any project that aims to upend the capitalist system.
Thank you. Larry, I think you...
Just a couple of points. One about no deal. I mean, the reason that no deal is more likely is because the government effectively took no deal off the table at the start of the negotiations. You know, the government's got in this position because the EU didn't think we were serious about leaving without a deal. Therefore, it's made no deal paradoxically, you know, more probable. I mean, I think that the risks of no deal have been massively overhyped. I mean, you read papers, including my own, about how, you know, plague of locusts is going to descend on the country in the event that, you know, tariffs go up on certain goods. I mean, you know, the idea that this is going to lead to, you know, the supermarkets being emptied of food and no drugs in hospitals, it just seems to me to be absolutely OTT. And most people treat it with the sort of contempt that they treated Project Fear. I mean, you know, the latest lot of retail sales figures showed absolutely zero sign of people going out and stockpiling baked beans and bottled water. I mean, because people are just a lot more sensible than that. So, and if no deal happened, that would be the best way of getting some sort of deal. It would concentrate minds. It would actually force sensible people to say, actually, we do need some sort of trading arrangement with the EU. So I'm not at all frightened of no deal, and I think it would actually lead to a speeding up of negotiations rather than the opposite. I think the interesting question is really about Labour's position. I sort of understand where Corbyn's coming from, because essentially he is an old-fashioned Eurosceptic. His heart is with us, and he knows the problems of the European Union. He voted against virtually every integrationist neoliberal project that there was. The problem is that Corbyn is where he is as leader of the Labour Party, with the votes primarily of people who back Remain. So he's been trying to back both horses at once and really keep his head down and hope that the Tories own the Brexit mess and that he can, you know, have a general election and come to power. I think the risk is that if Labour gets this wrong, it will go the way of other European socialist parties. It's an absolutely pivotal moment. If Labour is seen to betray its old working class constituency, it will become the moment when it goes down the route of becoming essentially a white, middle-class, public sector party that looks after a certain interests, who sees socialism as, you know, having a new bike lane or a better recycling policy, but actually doesn't actually want to have fundamental change. And I think that really is the problem I have with a lot of the Remain people in the Labour Party, is that essentially they are small C Conservatives. They're quite comfortable with the current status quo and don't want to see anything. That is why this is an absolutely pivotal moment for the left, because if it gets it wrong, it will be years, if not decades, before we see the opportunity of another radical Labour government.